for our next session, we're going to move into hearing from Anna, who is a leader for Maine Youth for Climate Justice. She's amazing and has a lot of wisdom to offer our network and has been doing organizing across Maine around climate emergency declarations and implementations. And I had a conversation with her a few months ago that was so interesting that I was like, you have to talk to our network and share kind of the things that you're working through in implementing climate emergency policy and especially overcoming funding challenges. So excited to hear from Anna. She's going to be sharing for a bit and then we're going to have a Q&A. So if any questions come up for you, please make sure you note them down so that you can ask them for the Q&A.
Awesome. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold, so forgive me if that happens again. But thank you so much for having me. My name's Anna, and my pronouns are she, her. I am a founding member of the coalition Maine Youth for Climate Justice, and I'm also the campaigns coordinator of Maine Youth Action. As you can tell, I'm calling in from Maine, and that is where most of my climate organizing is around. It's very state-centric, and that has meant a lot when it comes to federal funding being given to states, and then how can we harness that for climate action, particularly ARPA funding and potential BIF funding. So I've done a lot of work with climate emergency declarations in Maine. I was originally a strikes organizer before the pandemic, and strikes weren't an accessible option anymore. And what we would do with those strikes was, rather than gathering people in a space we wanted to have a demand. We wanted to have there be a driving point to every strike, instead of kind of gathering people together without the intention behind it. And when I was looking for what that demand could be, how do we ask for more than just climate action? How do we ask for something tangible? I came upon the climate mobilization, and I reached out, and I heard a lot about climate emergencies. And so when I organized the September 2019 global climate strike in Maine, I made sure that our big demand was that the city of Portland, which is their largest city, and its sister city, South Portland, would declare a climate emergency. We held the strike, everything went well, and within 2 months, both cities had declared a climate emergency, the first in Maine, and then many more through the actions of Maine Youth for Climate Justice followed. Right now, we have, getting to a dozen municipalities that have declared a climate emergency across the state, which is really exciting. Except then we ran into a problem, which I like to call declaration without implementation. I do a lot of press work, so I like those nifty sound bites. And what happens with that is municipalities, I'm sure you guys have experienced this as you've all done climate organizing, but they kind of wipe their hands clean. They're like, great, we did the super hard work of voting this through our town council, and now we're done. Great. We could put that in the filing cabinet. We listen to the youth, and that is not fun because it doesn't get us anywhere. It gets a lot of press attention for the town and not much else. And so what we have been doing is trying to get them to implement and do the follow-up work. So at the same time that we're trying to get more municipalities to declare a climate emergency, we're also trying to get the ones that already did to actually do the work, which is a struggle, particularly because the main thing they say is we don't have the money. One way to proactively deal with this is to work in money issues into the resolution, which we increasingly started to do as we did more climate emergency declarations. We made sure that there was, in the declaration, it said you had to set aside X budget, or you have to, make sure that it is fiscally supported. But retroactively, if that wasn't part of the declaration, like some of them weren't, they could easily just say we don't have the money. And technically, it's a non-binding resolution, even though we incorporate certain deadlines into ours, like short-term deadlines. And so there was not much we could do about that, rather than kind of advocating every time that they voted for a new budget, until we heard about the ARPA funding, and just federal funding in general, rather than saying like ARPA, BIF, or like BBB funding that might be happening. I'm just going to call it federal funding overall. That just means any money that's coming from the Biden administration in response to the pandemic, or that sort of thing, that's being distributed to states, counties, and municipalities. And that was huge. Maine got massive amounts of money. Our counties got massive amounts of money. And we were worried that would be spent on things that weren't, there's so many sectors that need money right now, but we felt that it was particularly important that infrastructure, broadband, and climate action got it. And we were worried that money would kind of go into like pothole repairs and things like that. Because infrastructure is very broad and towns could kind of do what they wanted. So what we did was Maine Youth for Climate Justice kind of saw a problem, which is that every single environmental organization in Maine was trying to figure out what was happening with federal funding separately. It is very confusing. We weren't really sure what was going on. When was ARPA coming out? How much was it going to be? Who was going to get it? Who was going to distribute it? And Sierra Club was trying to figure that out. Maine Youth for Climate Justice was trying to figure that out. Everyone was doing it on their own. And so we saw that problem and we built a coalition. We got everyone to come together in the same Zoom room, and everyone shared their own resources, and we sketched a timeline. We figured out where the money was going to go and how it was going to go from everyone's own research they'd done, and we pulled it into a big Google Drive, which is now the most helpful thing. And we were able to figure out through this collaboration where we needed to focus, which is super, super helpful. And what we figured out from this is that there's two levels of work. There's state level work and there's municipal level work. State level work is finding the intervention points within state administration. Where is money being allocated? Where is money being allocated? How is it being allocated? And where can we put our foot in the door? Finding those points where you can put your foot in the door is key because they don't often want to tell you where those points are. You kind of had to figure that out. So a really good example is that Maine Housing was going to approve $20 million of ARPA money. And it had nothing to do with retrofits or renewables. It was just about housing, which is great, but why would we build all this new housing and then retrofit it later? Why not build housing with renewable energy? So we saw that the rules were going to be finalized very shortly in April. So coming up, and we got a bill written, and it says that this has to be amended, that there has to be renewable energy incorporated for this money going to Maine Housing. And we got that bill sponsored by a lovely representative, and it is now doing very well in the legislature. And our legislature will adjourn soon, and hopefully the bill will pass. So that's an example of how we were able to get our foot in the door. We saw a place where money could be used for climate action, and we took that opportunity. It's a lot about timing too. There was that rush of rules being finalized in April, trying to get the bill language out, trying to get that coalition going. A lot of technical terms that had to be sorted through, but that's the state level work. And then the municipal level work is working with the municipalities, as what I was talking before, making sure they actually can get their climate emergency declarations in action using this money. A lot of towns just weren't really aware that this money was available. I don't know how applicable this is to other states, but Maine has weird systems of county government. So money wasn't going directly to municipalities, it was going to counties. So towns weren't really sure that they even could access this money. And so, Cumberland County would just keep it on their own and use it for, road repairs and without a lot of input from others. And so what a lot of the stuff that we were doing is telling people that the opportunity was available, just saying that you, by filling out X form, by looking into this grant, you can obtain large sums of money for climate projects. And then the state also did come around and do something good and did release these climate resilience grants. Maine has a department called the Governor's Office for Policy Innovation in the Future, which is a very fancy way of saying the climate office. And they released these climate resilience grants for municipalities, but also not a lot of municipalities knew about them. So we were reaching out to the ones that declared climate emergency and said, hey, since you guys already declared, you already have this benchmarks and you already have the equity assessment in, because that's part of the declaration, you hit all the marks to get this climate resilience grant. And helping them get there, write out the grant, submit it for a project, and be on their way. So that was super helpful, and kind of that's the state level, municipal level work, trying to figure out those two tiers of where can we help, where can we find contacts in municipalities who can start projects that are then eligible for grants. Also, looking regionally was very helpful for us. When we didn't have certain information, we would reach out to Renew New England, which is this kind of regional network of this coalition called Renew that's in every state, and they had a lot of ARPA resources. And so that kind of coalition building, expanding from Maine, was also helpful. My key takeaways from this work was first to find an inroads with a high-level individual in state administration who is sympathetic to your cause and can provide insight that cuts through all the bureaucracy and public outreach issues. Because a lot of state administrations aren't very transparent about where money is going to flow. And even if they are, it's hidden in websites that are hard to find. So if you can find someone who is in an office or an appropriations committee or knows where money is going, who will talk to you, you can get a lot of great information. For example, the director of the governor's office for policy innovation in the future, I reached out to him. He's known to have been supportive of youth work. And you kind of take your angle. I said like, oh, I need to learn more. I'm a young person, doesn't really understand how this works. Can you tell me how ARPA funding is? It's so confusing. And he was like, cool, I'll tell you all about it. And basically gave me a detailed list of all the allocations, so that we knew where all the money was going to go. And there was also a legislator who I worked with on divestment who gave us a list of various more detailed, like the pools of money, also very helpful. And then the second big takeaway is to work intergenerationally to pool resources and eliminate redundancies. I talked about this earlier, but if everyone's trying to figure out money at the same time, that's not helpful. So if you can all come together, youth and adults, kind of figure this all out, then you have everything in the same place. And while working intergenerationally may seem a weird format for it because it's more techy, the youth are often the ones pushing for climate emergency declarations, at least in Maine. That's just my own experience. And it is incredibly frustrating to have us be roadblocked by these financial issues. And so by reaching out to adults and saying, hey, work with us and help us figure this out, and then we could continue to drive forward the climate emergency declarations, that was a super helpful partnership. My last key takeaway about this is get a sense of the timeline. Learn, when is the money going to be allocated? What are the deadlines? When do you need to have your grant submitted by? Or when will the window close for public comment on changing where the money goes? Because without knowing what's going to happen, then you're out of luck for putting your foot in that door. That's kind of my overview of this. I was supposed to do 10 minutes. I think that was 12, but I think I got it. But thank you so much for, kind of listening to me ramble about that. I'm still like very sick, so like a little bit of brain fog. But does anyone have any questions? We also do 10 minutes for questions, so it's not like not wanting to take up time.
I have a question from Houston. Have you had much luck in getting movement on implementing the climate emergencies that have been passed?
So we've had better luck in communities where two things, the declarations were better. We learned a lot. The Portland and South Portland declarations, which were our first in 2019, were very loose. They were very non-binding. They had very little teeth, as we call it. And that was our bad. Like we didn't really know what we were doing yet, but we were doing our best. And so as we did more, we put in more of these short-term deadlines. Okay, 60 days after you pass the resolution, you had to have informed the town and done a public meeting. 60 days after that, you had to have the task force ready. 120 days after that, you had to have the baseline assessment, that sort of thing. That helps a lot. Because then the town is like, oh, it's not just we need to do this by 2030, we need to do this by next month. So making simply better declarations that are more multifaceted and have long-term goals, short-term goals, and immediate next steps, super helpful. The other thing is to have people who are engaged for the long run. I talked about how towns will be like, oh great, we passed it. We're such great people, we're done. I will say that sometimes it's the same with the people who are passing them. I did this. You know, it's like you do all that work, you work with the bureaucratic town, you finally pass it on a vote, and you're so happy. And you're like, great, we're done. We passed it. That's another climate emergency declaration. Move on to the next town. And so I guess it's not fair for me to just say that's the towns who do the same thing. It's also the activists to a degree, because we want that success. And that's great. You want to revel in your win because otherwise you'll burn out from just pushing, pushing, pushing. But at a certain point, you had to circle back and you had to say, okay, so what's the town doing? So we've had better success in municipalities where the team stayed active after the declaration. For example, we worked with elementary schoolers to pass a climate emergency declaration. Adorable. It worked really well. Town council was super sympathetic, but those elementary schoolers weren't exactly plugged in to do the follow-up work, which is totally valid, totally fine. But when we did the same work with college students, they were, checking back in, setting up meetings with their town administrator and kind of saying like, okay, what are you doing? So that was super helpful. Oh yeah, I didn't think about calling on people. Tamara, you have your hand up?
Yeah, so I'm curious, like, how long did it take to pull the coalition together and to figure out and dig through the work of the federal funding and the language and everything? I found that even in the small town, that this small city that I live in, they already have decided, the city manager already decided how they're going to spend the money for the budget for next year. So like how much ahead of time did you have to be prepared?
So we weren't, and that's kind of where and that's what I was talking about with intervention points, where they had already allocated all the money, but there were these certain stipulations about kind of individual state departments then had to finalize their own set of rules. So so it was already allocated that they had to put $20 million to Maine Housing. That was already set in stone. But then Maine Housing had to finalize it by a certain date. And then we had the opportunity to say, hang on, before you finalize it. So that was kind of the advantage there. It did take a while, and the coalition isn't totally set. It's very fluid. We meet when we need to. We haven't needed to for a very long time. We met a few times originally to pull together those resources, get everyone on the same page, make sure that we weren't confused, and have that Google Drive of all the information. And we haven't met in a while because we haven't needed to. Everyone's kind of doing their own work. Everyone's using the same resources that we pulled together to do the state. There's another little coalition focused on Maine Housing. There's another little one forming that's going to be doing labor work. It kind of broke off into interests, and that's totally okay because the main goal was just to make sure that we all were doing the same thing. So it took a little while because Renew New England was going to come up with that guide, and we were waiting for the guide. But with that, it went a lot faster. Harmony?
This is definitely an amazing story. And how did you guys agree on how to spend the money and allocate the funds?
So it's really a case by case basis. I'm talking a lot about state work, but I also work with my own town, Yarmouth, and I'm on the climate committee there. And I had them pass a climate emergency declaration, kind of working on the inside versus an outside activist standpoint, which was a different perspective. And helping them decide what to apply for the grants and how to allocate that grant money. It's very case specific. So I know Yarmouth is a suburb. It doesn't like to do anything bold and drastic. So it wanted to do it for LED lights. And I said, please, let's not do this for LED lights. Let's try to go a little bit above and beyond here. So we got LED lights easily through something else because that's something that was already covered. And so I'm now pushing them to use the money for a baseline assessment for carbon emissions because we haven't done that since like 2000. And so to do our climate action plan, we need an updated baseline to see what our emissions are. So it's you're kind of working with people individually. As a group, like figuring out when we're writing a bill and trying to put our foot in that door and say to state administration when they finalize the rules, we want you to spend the money a certain way. That's kind of a coalition being on all the same page. And our stipulations for that, where to spend the money, is based on three things. Is it bold? Is it equitable? And is it feasible? That's kind of my like three rules for like any legislation that I'm working on, like deciding to undertake it as a project. And that also applies to allocating money. Yeah, Zara?
Hey, thanks so much for your presentation, Anna. Yeah, I just wanted to bump a question in the chat actually that I also found really interesting, and that was, has anyone had success getting resolutions passed with funding commitments attached?
Is this directed at me or like to the general group? Because I'd actually love to hear this from the group.
Either.
Sorry, I kind of froze for a second. But I'm happy to answer it. But also, if other people want to answer in the chat, go for it. We've had 2 or 3 municipalities pass resolutions / declarations that said that they'd set aside 1% of their budget for it. And then when we try to do that, and it's interesting, we've had very different responses. In one municipality, they said, when we try to do that, they said, no, like, of course not, that's way too much. Another one, they said, that's not enough. We're not going to do that because that won't nearly cover the cost of climate work. So it'd be silly to put that in the resolution. We were like, oh, okay. It was like very odd. But so we've had some success with that. It's kind of varied, kind of based on how carefully they read into it. Often, like, they're like, okay, climate emergency, and they don't see like that specific thing. But what I've been looking into a little bit was, I was doing some research last year or 2 years ago about reducing other creative refinancing of budgets versus just simply plugging more money into something, trying to figure out if towns can rework their annual budgets to, potentially decrease money from ammunition or the police department into the climate action plan, and things like that, or raising or doing graduated property taxes and so I was kind of doing a bit of that, poking around, and that's also an option that did not go over well in a lot of communities. I didn't officially propose it. I was just kind of curious to see it, but the 2 towns I talked about it casually with were not happy about that one. Derek?
Hi, Anna. So I was wondering, what is the mechanism for enforcing those budget like uses? Is it in the grant when you write the grant itself, or is it like in the implementation of the grant by the government?
Sorry, I missed a word. What's the mechanism that enforces the?
Like the use of the money. Was it when you write the grant?
Oh, yeah. So these grants coming from the state, and I don't know how applicable this is. Like, I have a very like bubbled view because I only do Maine work. I don't know if there's any sort of similar funding mechanism in other states, but in our case, the funding comes from the state. You apply for the grant. They have very harsh rules about who gets it, and then you're only allowed to use the money for X project. So you can't say I'm using it for a climate action plan. You had to say I'm using it for one specific thing. That could be a seawall, that could be doing a baseline assessment, that could be replacing the municipal fleet with EVs. And you can pick projects within your climate action plan to fund it with. So I think that's how it's enforced. It's the metrics. They see if you've done that very specific project.
Thank you.
Oh, I see a question in the chat about rural Republican areas. I've done, the more work that I've done is like kind of moderate Democrat, like suburban, kind of careful about like not being too drastic in any sense, or like scared of being radical. The only like rural Republican work we've done is more stakeholder based, like trying to convince people who are in the lobstering industry who may be more Republican leaning, that like climate should matter to them because of their catch is disappearing or things like that. The one municipality that we tried to have a declaration in a more conservative area didn't go very well, but that was also due to like little follow-up from the group that was doing it, like I talked about earlier. They weren't, it was the people on the ground weren't super committed and they had to go to college, and so that wasn't a great case study. Also, Maria, do we have time for these questions? Because I'm happy to answer more of them. Okay, cool. Okay, one last question. I'm gonna say Shira because Azara already answered one of your questions. I'm sorry.
Oh, thanks. So this is a general question. I don't know if we're going to go for a climate emergency declaration or not, because we're just getting a mayor's caucus declaration supporting the mayor's caucus goals, which are similar, but it doesn't have the specificity. But we have a sustainability plan coming into play this year. So the details could potentially go into that. Have you worked with anyone like where it might not be a climate emergency declaration per se, but where you get all of that content into something like a sustainability plan to have the concrete plan?
Yeah,
and
there's a lot of
with the funding and everything.
yeah, there's a lot of groups who've done that. So that's kind of, you just skip the heart, like the vote, basically. I mean, there's a lot of communities where we've reached out and said, hey, you should pass climate emergency declaration. They say, well, we actually passed this comprehensive plan or the sustainability plan last year. And then you just skip to the implementation, essentially. You're rather than working to get anything declared, you're doing that follow-up. What I would do personally, this is what I do in that situation. I pull up a really good climate emergency declaration that has like all the harsh deadlines and all the funding requirements. And then I pull up the plan that they passed and I compare them and I see what's missing. And then I push them on what's missing. So for example, a town in Maine, Saco, just passed a comp plan. And so I compared the comp plan and their climate emergency in a different climate emergency declaration. And I saw that the comp plan was great, except it didn't have some of that binding teeth. And then it was already passed. Differ, and where the deficiency is in terms of it being good, like enough, is good to have.
Do you have a specific one that you would recommend for that comparison?
I like, again, very Maine focused. We have one, there's Bar Harbor passed a really good one in Maine, and so I've been using theirs. I actually like the Yarmouth one a lot. The Yarmouth one was like really like, we went over like 50 times. It was very frustrating. But that's just like, I could send you the one that I use, but I don't know if the climate mobilization has a better one that they use, because we make ours super site specific. So it'll be talking about Maine ski mountains and how they'll get less snow. So there'd be a lot of like editing and changing you'd have to do to make it more your own.
Cool. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Thanks for asking these really amazing questions. And Anna, thank you for sharing so much wisdom with all of us. I really appreciate it. Just because of time, we have to move on to our next section, but there's been a lot of interesting questions also and comments in the chat. So I'm wondering, Anna, do you just want to share potentially your email so that if people have more questions, they can reach out to you?
Yes, general plug. I do a lot of calls with people who are doing climate emergency work in other states, just sharing tips and tricks. I don't know, that sounds weird, but also divestment. I do a lot of divestment work. So if you want to reach out and be like, hey, I'm doing a divestment plan, or I'm trying to figure out how to do climate emergency, or you just want to chat about it, or you just want to chat, you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat. I do have to go do homework, so I am going to leave after this, but feel free to message